Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Sarah Fenske. We've all seen American Sign Language interpreters hard at work during this pandemic. The governor may be the one talking, but it's an interpreter translating their words for the deaf audience. That makes these translators truly an essential service. Now, today, of course, that work looks different than it did back before we all started sheltering in place. Now they're translating Zoom calls, not rock concerts. And it presents unique challenges. Just how do you say coronavirus in American Sign Language? So here to discuss the life of a sign language interpreter is Nicole DeVore. She is the Interpreter Services Manager with Paraquad's Deaf Way Interpreting Services. Nicole, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
So let's cut right to the chase. Walk us through this. Don't just do the sign, but how would you say coronavirus in American Sign Language?
It's kind of hard to describe without a visual, but it basically, if you take your left hand and make a fist, your right hand and open five hand, and it starts at the wrist area and then rotates. It almost looks like it looks like what the coronavirus looks like.
I was going to say, as you were describing this, I'm picturing that little horned virus. It makes sense. So how does that come about? Who decides that's how coronavirus is signed?
Well, it's like with any language. It's always changing and growing, and deaf people, sign language is very, pictorial, very gestural, and so it just kind of, somebody, as with any language, somebody starts it along the way, and it kind of spreads like wildfire, and then at some point becomes the accepted sign for something.
So there's no committee that has to sign off on this or something. It just kind of evolves the way English evolves.
Exactly, like just natural language.
So how frequently do you see some big new word come on the scene that you're all of a sudden having to use with such great frequency like this?
Fairly often, all of the slang terms and all of the kind of neat buzzwords that are out there end up with signs. There's a lot of Facebook groups and connections that are made where these things kind of become available to us. And so, as an interpreter, you're always trying to keep up with the times. So you kind of make sure that you're getting access to these new terms as they come along.
So if you learn a new term, then it seems like the second half of that would be making sure that it makes sense for the audience that you're introducing it to. I imagine you can't just start inserting it into conversation. What does that introduction look like the first time coronavirus may come up in a conversation you're translating?
So usually when an interpreter is introducing something like that, you would fingerspell the word first. So you would fingerspell coronavirus and then assign it that particular sign. So then from the briefing, the conversation, from then on, that sign has already been labeled coronavirus, and so it's just understood.
That does make sense. These are these things that I think many of us never think about, and it's fascinating to think of how these languages evolve. I'm wondering now, in your case, what got you interested in learning American Sign Language in the first place?
I grew up with a friend of mine that was deaf, and our family just kind of naturally learned the language from them, and it just kind of went from there. It became a career for me that I've really enjoyed.
When did you realize that it was a career? Did you have to get some specialized training?
So back when I became an interpreter, specialized training was not necessarily required. That was 25 years ago, and things have gotten, far more advanced in becoming an interpreter. I basically kind of fell into it, and I knew the language. I had a lot of people that were willing to mentor me and support me, deaf and interpreters, and they kind of, guided me through. Now you would go to an interpreter training program, and then there is Missouri state testing that is required.
Oh, there's like a formal test now.
Yes.
Okay. And then are you licensed? You're certified? What's the proper word for that?
So both. You get you pass a certification test, and then you get licensed in the state of Missouri and in Illinois.
So you're also a manager with Paraquad service in addition to doing this translation yourself. How in demand are these services in the St. Louis metro?
So interpreting in general is in very high demand. There is a shortage of interpreters that is not expected to resolve for 10 to 15 years. And so we are constantly looking for new interpreters. We're trying to encourage people to get into the field because it's very, very busy.
And busy in what ways? I mean, we all see interpreters now standing behind the governor and doing just these marvelous interpretations of what they're saying in real time. But obviously, up until we hit the pandemic, that wasn't a huge source of work for you guys. Where were Paraquad's services being employed?
So the short answer is just about everywhere that you can imagine. I know that there has been an interpreter. We do, a vast majority of our work is medical and legal, but also education from, kindergarten all the way through, PhD, just about anywhere that you can imagine. It's pretty wild ride sometimes.
Now, you mentioned legal or medical. These seem like things where they have such a lexicon that even for people who are hearing, half the time people don't even know what these words are that are being thrown out. Do people have to develop a specialty in order to handle something like that?
They do. And in this day and age, there's so much available, thankfully, that people can tap into. It starts with basically learning, in English, what are these things? What does all of this mean? And then kind of, exploring options for how to sign different concepts. So it's an intense amount of work to kind of get prepared to be a medical or legal interpreter.
And if you're doing medical or legal, does that pay better than, say, you're signing a rap concert?
So it all depends. The people who are doing those things, the medical and legal, tend to have a higher certification, and so they kind of just naturally make more. So the short answer is yes, it does pay a little better.
So it makes sense to have a specialty, if that's what you're pursuing. Do you yourself have anything you specialize in?
I do. I work mainly in medical and legal interpreting.
Okay. So you've pursued those specialties, and words like plaintiff, you know how to sign plaintiff.
Yes, I do.
That's awesome. And so you're there in court. How is it affected by the fact that now no one's in person? Are people bringing you in on video for these legal hearings?
Yes, things have gotten very creative, and we use different platforms, kind of like Zoom. Everybody kind of has their preference, but to interpret remotely. And so it would be like any other video call that, the interpreter could see the deaf person and vice versa, and you just interpret as if you were in person.
Are there challenges to trying to do it that way?
For sure. Visibility is often a problem, and then you're used to seeing a language in 3D. Now you're in 2D, so that's a little bit, odd at times. And then, like anybody else, internet connection is often a problem. And so as long as everything's going smooth, it works great, but oftentimes it does not run.
Yeah, I imagine as much as it's so hard when people's voices freeze, when you're there frozen and your whole job is you want to stay up with this conversation, you must be just ready to tear your hair out.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, you mentioned this 2D versus 3D aspect. That's so intriguing to me. Are there certain signs where maybe they just don't come across quite as well on a video screen as if you were in person with someone?
Absolutely. So much of, we use vocal inflection, and we use, certain tones to express feeling and to express intensity. And in sign language, those are done with the face and the body and different gestures, and different intensity is assigned to signs to mean different things. And so sometimes that interpretation can be lost trying to view it on a small screen that may or may not be cooperating.
So is there ever a chance, if you're translating for somebody and something isn't coming through clearly, to slow down or do a rewind?
There is, and people are very patient, and sometimes we'll do, the interpreter will ask for clarification in certain sittings, especially, if it's something, truly serious, medical or legal. They will ask to have things maybe explained better, or broken down to something that is easier to interpret for each individual varies in their level of understanding. So.
Now, I've got to ask one last question, and I have to apologize in advance if this is a dumb question. But when I was reading up on this, I learned that American Sign Language actually has regional dialects. And, there's always this great question of whether St. Louis is Southern or Midwestern. What part of the regional dialect do we fall into?
So, well, that's a very good question. I never thought of that. I would say that we fall into definitely a Midwest dialect. St. Louis is kind of a hot spot for deaf people because of different schooling options that are here. And so you'll see a lot of influence from other dialects that are kind of part of the St. Louis sign language usage, I guess you would say. But we're definitely Midwestern, I would think.
Okay, so we're kind of a hub, but we have that Midwestern accent going on when we're doing our American Sign Language.
Yes.
Wow, well, I've learned something new today about St. Louis, so I have to thank you for that. It's good to know this new thing. And Nicole DeVore, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And Nicole, again, is the Interpreter Services Manager with Paraquad's Deafway Interpreting Services, just doing valuable work translating things into American Sign Language for deaf people or people who need that service done. And how interesting to learn about all the various facets of that. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. That's 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.